Have you ever stopped to think about where your food really comes from? Sure, we all know it's grown on farms, harvested, and sent to grocery stores, but what happens to it before it gets to your plate is something most people never question. The shiny apples, the crisp lettuce, the plump tomatoes. On the surface, they look perfect. But behind this illusion of freshness lies a hidden reality that might just shock you. The truth is, much of the food we eat is steeped in a silent but insidious danger: pesticides. These chemicals, designed to protect crops from pests, weeds, and diseases, have been hailed as one of the greatest tools in modern agriculture. But their use comes with a price we're all paying, often without even realizing it. Pesticides don't just kill insects, they infiltrate everything. They sink into the soil, seep into the water, and cling to the food we consume. And here's the kicker. Once they enter our bodies, they don't just disappear. They accumulate over time, potentially setting off a cascade of health risks. Now, you might be thinking, if these chemicals are so dangerous, why are they even allowed? Well, that's where things get complicated. The agricultural industry spends billions marketing pesticides as essential for feeding the world's population. We're told that without them, crop yields would plummet, food prices would soar, and widespread hunger would ensue. But is that the whole truth? Or just a convenient narrative designed to keep us from questioning what's really happening? In this video, we're pulling back the curtain to expose the dark side of pesticides, their impact on our crops, our health, and the environment as a whole. You'll learn how these chemicals, once hailed as miracles of modern science, are now wreaking havoc on ecosystems, killing off vital pollinators, and leaving a toxic legacy in their wake. And perhaps most chillingly, you'll discover how this widespread pesticide use is putting your health and the health of future generations at risk. So why should you care? Because this isn't just a story about farming or science. It's about the food you eat, the air you breathe, and the water you drink. It's about understanding what we've allowed to happen to our planet in the name of progress, and asking ourselves if it's worth the cost. By the end of this video, you might never look at your dinner plate the same way again.
To understand how we became so dependent on pesticides, we need to go back in time, to the 1940s and 50s, during a period known as the Green Revolution. This era was marked by rapid advancements in agriculture, driven by the urgent need to feed a rapidly growing global population. At the heart of this revolution were innovations like synthetic fertilizers, high-yield crop varieties, and, yes, pesticides. These chemicals were celebrated as the ultimate solution to an age-old problem: how to protect crops from destructive pests and diseases. The first generation of pesticides, like DDT, seemed almost magical. Farmers were suddenly able to produce more food than ever before. Crops that were once vulnerable to insects and weeds now flourished. Yields skyrocketed, and hunger levels dropped in many parts of the world. It was a success story that seemed too good to be true, and as history would show, it was. You see, what no one fully considered at the time were the long-term consequences of unleashing synthetic chemicals into delicate ecosystems. The early signs were subtle. Birds and fish in areas where pesticides were heavily used began dying off. Certain pests, instead of being eradicated, started developing resistance to the chemicals, forcing farmers to use stronger and more frequent applications. And the worst part? These pesticides didn't just stay on the farms where they were sprayed. They traveled through the soil, the air, and the water. But the story doesn't end there. As the use of pesticides exploded worldwide, so did the profits for the chemical companies producing them. By the 1970s, corporations like Monsanto were at the forefront of the pesticide industry, marketing their products as essential for feeding the world. Governments too bought into the narrative, subsidizing chemical agriculture and turning a blind eye to mounting evidence of environmental and health risks. Today, we're living with the consequences of those decisions. The same pesticides that were once praised as revolutionary are now causing widespread destruction, poisoning wildlife, contaminating water supplies, and entering the very food we eat. And while the industry continues to assure us that pesticides are safe when used properly, the truth is far more complex. Studies have shown that even low levels of exposure can have cumulative effects over time, impacting not just human health, but entire ecosystems. So, how did something that was supposed to save the world turn into one of its greatest threats? The answer lies in the unchecked power of the pesticide industry, the complacency of regulatory bodies, and the false belief that technology can solve every problem without creating new ones. As we move forward in this video, we'll explore the hidden costs of this reliance on pesticides, costs that are becoming harder and harder to ignore. Let's shift the focus to something deeply personal: how pesticides affect human health. It's easy to think of these chemicals as a distant problem, confined to farms and fields. But the reality is, pesticides are far closer to us than we realize. On the food we eat, in the water we drink, and even in the air we breathe. And their effects on our bodies are far more alarming than most of us have been led to believe. Every year, billions of pounds of pesticides are sprayed on crops worldwide. These chemicals are designed to kill. They target pests by disrupting their nervous systems, damaging their cells, or interfering with their ability to survive. But here's the unsettling truth: those same mechanisms can also harm humans. Pesticides don't distinguish between a pest and a person. Over time, exposure to even small amounts of these chemicals can accumulate in our bodies, creating a toxic cocktail with far-reaching consequences. Research has linked pesticides to a host of health problems. One of the most alarming connections is to cancer. Certain pesticides, like glyphosate, a key ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, have been classified as probable carcinogens by organizations like the World Health Organization. Farmers and agricultural workers who are in direct contact with these chemicals have significantly higher rates of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemia, and other cancers. But it's not just them. Traces of these chemicals often remain on fruits and vegetables, meaning anyone who consumes conventionally grown produce is at risk of low-level exposure. And cancer is just the tip of the iceberg. Pesticides have also been linked to neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease, developmental delays in children, and reproductive health issues. Pregnant women exposed to certain pesticides are at higher risk of miscarriage, preterm births, and birth defects. Even infants and young children, who are far more vulnerable to toxins due to their developing bodies, aren't spared. Studies have shown that exposure to pesticides during critical stages of development can lead to learning disabilities, attention disorders, and lower IQs. What makes this even more troubling is how pervasive pesticides have become. A study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found pesticide residues in the urine of over 90% of participants. Think about that for a moment. The vast majority of people, whether they live near a farm or not, carry traces of these chemicals in their bodies. Despite this mounting evidence, the pesticide industry continues to insist that their products are safe when used as directed. But here's the problem. Safety regulations are often based on outdated science, focusing on acute exposure rather than the cumulative effects of long-term, low-level exposure. What we're left with is a regulatory system that underestimates the risks, leaving millions of people vulnerable to harm. So where does that leave us? It's clear that the health risks of pesticides aren't hypothetical. They're very real and already affecting countless lives. The next time you bite into a shiny apple or a juicy strawberry, ask yourself, what invisible price are we paying for this so-called perfection? Let's start with the soil, the foundation of all life on land. Healthy soil is teeming with microorganisms, fungi, and insects, all working together to create the nutrients that plants need to grow. But pesticides, particularly herbicides and fungicides, disrupt this delicate balance. They kill off beneficial organisms, leaving the soil degraded, sterile, and less able to support crops. Over time, this leads to a vicious cycle. Farmers are forced to rely on even more chemical fertilizers and pesticides to compensate for the depleted soil, further perpetuating the problem. Then there's the issue of water contamination. When it rains, pesticides are washed off fields and carried into nearby water sources. Streams, rivers, and even underground aquifers become tainted with toxic chemicals, endangering aquatic life and polluting drinking water supplies. In some cases, the levels of contamination are staggering. For example, studies have shown that certain pesticides like atrazine can disrupt the hormonal systems of fish and amphibians, leading to deformities and population declines. And these effects don't just stop at wildlife. Humans who rely on these water sources are exposed to the same toxins. But perhaps the most heartbreaking impact of pesticides can be seen in the decline of pollinators like bees, butterflies, and birds. Bees, in particular, are essential to global agriculture, responsible for pollinating over 70% of the crops we eat. Yet populations of honeybees and wild bees have plummeted in recent decades, largely due to a class of pesticides called neonicotinoids. These chemicals disrupt the bees' ability to navigate, forage, and reproduce, leading to colony collapse on an unprecedented scale. Without pollinators, entire ecosystems are at risk of collapse, and crops like almonds, apples, and berries could disappear from our plates. And it doesn't end there. Pesticides also harm larger animals, including mammals and birds, which are exposed through contaminated food and water. Predators like hawks and owls, which feed on rodents from treated fields, often ingest lethal doses. In the 1960s, Rachel Carson's groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, warned of a world where pesticides had wiped out so many birds that spring would pass without the sound of their songs. More than half a century later, that warning feels eerily prophetic. Even the air we breathe isn't safe. Pesticide particles can drift miles from the fields where they're sprayed, carried by wind into neighboring communities. This phenomenon, known as pesticide drift, puts entire populations, especially those living near agricultural zones, at risk of unintentional exposure. In some areas, families have reported spikes in respiratory illnesses, headaches, and other health issues after nearby pesticide applications. What makes all of this even more disheartening is that much of this damage is irreversible. Once an ecosystem is poisoned, it can take decades or even centuries for it to recover. Species pushed to the brink of extinction by pesticides may never return. And the more we rely on these chemicals, the more we erode the natural systems that sustain us. So, as we continue to spray these toxic substances in the name of higher crop yields and profit, we have to ask ourselves, at what cost? How much of our planet are we willing to sacrifice for short-term gains? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, pesticides infiltrating our food, health, and the planet. But here's the truth. We don't have to accept this reality. There are solutions, and while the challenge is enormous, so is the potential for change. Across the globe, farmers, scientists, activists, and everyday people are working to create a future where we can grow food sustainably without poisoning ourselves or the environment. Let's start with organic and regenerative farming practices. Unlike conventional farming, which relies heavily on synthetic chemicals, organic farming uses natural methods to manage pests and maintain soil health. Techniques like crop rotation, intercropping, and companion planting help disrupt pest life cycles and reduce infestations. For example, planting marigolds alongside vegetables can repel harmful insects without the need for toxic sprays. Meanwhile, regenerative agriculture goes even further, focusing on restoring soil health by incorporating composting, cover crops, and reduced tillage. Healthy soil not only reduces the need for pesticides, but also traps carbon, helping to combat climate change. Another promising solution lies in integrated pest management, or IPM. This approach combines traditional wisdom with modern science to create strategies that minimize pesticide use. Instead of blanketing fields with chemicals, IPM focuses on monitoring pest populations and using targeted interventions only when absolutely necessary. Biological controls, like introducing natural predators such as ladybugs to eat aphids, are a key part of this system. It's a smarter, more sustainable way to protect crops without wreaking havoc on ecosystems. Technology is also playing a pivotal role in reducing our reliance on pesticides. Precision agriculture, for instance, uses tools like drones, sensors, and satellite imagery to pinpoint exactly where pests are a problem. Instead of spraying entire fields, farmers can target specific areas, dramatically cutting down on pesticide use. Advances in genetic research are also helping scientists develop pest-resistant crop varieties, further reducing the need for chemical intervention. But beyond these solutions, there's another critical factor: you. As consumers, we have incredible power to drive change. By choosing organic or locally grown produce, you send a clear message to the agricultural industry that sustainability matters. Supporting farmers' markets and community-supported agriculture programs helps create demand for food grown without harmful chemicals. And advocating for stricter pesticide regulations, whether through petitions, protests, or simply spreading awareness, can pressure governments to take action. And it's not just about individual choices. Communities and policymakers have a role to play too. Several countries have already taken bold steps to ban some of the most toxic pesticides, like neonicotinoids and glyphosate. France, for instance, has committed to phasing out all synthetic pesticides by 2040. These efforts prove that change is possible when there's enough political will and public support. The fight against harmful pesticides isn't just about protecting crops or increasing yields. It's about safeguarding our health, preserving biodiversity, and ensuring that future generations inherit a planet capable of sustaining life. Imagine a world where food is grown in harmony with nature, a world where soil is alive, rivers run clean, and bees thrive alongside us. That's not a distant dream, it's a reality we can build together. But it starts with awareness and action. So the next time you shop for groceries or sit down to a meal, remember, every choice you make has an impact. Together we can break free from our dependence on toxic pesticides and create a food system that nurtures both people and the planet. The question is, are we ready to take that step?